good evening. This is Hound Dog Steve coming to you on the 13th of January, which is a Sunday evening. And a big, warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for returning to my channel, and I hope I can provide some news and some insight that you're maybe not getting from the mainstream media or off other channels. And so, thank you for subscribing. We're racing our way towards 9,000 subscribers. That is absolutely amazing. And so I was expecting a little bit more information about the Yellow Vest protests in France and Britain, and actually a subscriber of mine was going to send me over some video which hasn't arrived yet. But I also wanted to hear if there was any effects or how many people had made a move on withdrawing their euros and creating a bank run. But there's not much information, but there is a couple of pieces here that really just remind me of how propagandistic the news media is. And you know, they sort of paint things in, oh, it's failing, it's not going to work, and so on and so forth. And just as my previous video about Nigel Farage, a little Euronews clip there, is showing that there is absolute proof of collusion between George Soros and the EU, there is a collusion taking place between the media and the government and the corporations, who have an idea of where they want to go and where they don't want us to take them. Okay, so I've got a couple of news items here that I'd like to share with you, and so let's go over and take a look at those, and we'll come back and I'll have a quick wrap up. Okay, here we go. Yellow Vest protesters fight for ideological ownership. In France and Britain, Gilets jaunes have mutated into symbols of anger against anything from austerity to Islam. What is not in dispute is who came first. On the French side of the channel lie the original Gilets jaunes, Yellow Vests, a grassroots, social media-based citizens movement with no formal structure, recognised leader or party or union backing, named after the high visibility jackets that French drivers are required by law to carry in their vehicles. As the French Yellow Vests kicked off their 9th straight weekend of protests against President Emmanuel Macron's economic policies, a battle for ownership of what has become a symbol of anti-government agitation across Europe has broken out in Britain as left-wing anti-austerity activists donned yellow in a bid to wrestle it from the far right. The numbers involved. In France, hundreds of thousands have taken to the streets, are the most visible difference between the two countries. In Britain, Yellow Vest protesters have ranged from involving a few dozen, including those who blocked Westminster Bridge in December, through to thousands in London on Saturday who joined an anti-austerity protest addressed by figures including the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, and which included French jaunes. And this is why I think that we are going to see a continuation of these protests. This has been brewing for 40 years. Wages have been flat for 40 years. And just as the banks have basically played out every possible option that they've had to try and resolve the financial crisis, so every individual across the world has played out every option to fight off the invasive nature of inflation and the dwindling of your paycheck. So if it hasn't increased and it's being cut on a regular basis every year through inflation, you reach a point where you can no longer make ends meet, and that is this point, and that is why these protests will continue until we've reached some new status where people can survive without eating dog food. And so what is Macron doing? Macron launches national debate to calm Yellow Vest protests. And this is what they perennially do. These politicians, these elites, they are now throwing in these debates to try and diffuse the situation, to just give us a little bit more time, and maybe in 3 months there'll be another solution. Or it will just have tapered out, or people will have accepted the new status quo, and then they can carry on. And so what has happened, as I said, this has been over the past 40 years, but more especially in 2008, the banks stole literally trillions of dollars from the general public, and now they're going to make the public pay more money back on that money that was borrowed by increasing interest rates. Because it's not just the individual that has an increase in mortgage rate, it is your government, because they are in debt to the big banks, and when the prime rate goes up, the money that the government has to take out of the public increases. President Emmanuel Macron on Sunday kicked off a 3-month national debate he hopes can quell Yellow Vest unrest with a letter to the French in which he pledged to listen to new ideas but stuck to his core economic reform agenda. Macron's initiative comes after 9 weeks of protests by Yellow Vests, named after the highly visible jackets they wear. The disparate anti-government uprising has wreaked havoc in Paris and French cities, shaken the economy and challenged his authority. For me, there is no banning issue. We won't agree on everything, which is normal in a democracy, but at least we'll show we're a people which is not afraid of talking, exchanging, debating, Macron wrote in the letter published by his office. Chers Français, mes chers compatriots. My French friends, my French compatriots. Yeah, okay, we got it. But Macron said he would remain faithful to his campaign manifesto and appeared to rule out the rolling back of some of his pro-business economic reforms, such as scrapping a wealth tax, which have earned him the nickname of President for the Rich. When taxes are too high, our economy is starved of the resources that could be usefully invested in companies creating jobs and growth, Macron wrote. We will not undo the measures we have introduced to put this right, encourage investment and ensure that work pays more. Here we go, the questions. The questions that will be debated include: which taxes do you think should be lowered first? Should some public services that are out of date or too expensive be eliminated? There you go, cut services. They want to get you to agree to cut services. What concrete proposals do you think would accelerate our environmental transition? Well, poverty will of course accelerate your environmental transition, because if people can't afford to pay for gas, then they won't be driving, will they? Should we use more referendums? Well, of course you should. The immigration question asked: once our asylum obligations are fulfilled, do you want Parliament to be able to set annual targets? Well, the targets by the EU are unfulfillable, and they change on a dime. Brussels can rule against the targets set now and increase them at any moment, so you will never be able to fulfill those targets. While Macron assures that there were no forbidden questions, he did say that the right to seek asylum could not be questioned. He also said the government would not revisit the steps to encourage investment and make work pay more. Gilets jaunes staged 9th round of protests in France. Thousands of demonstrators turned out across France for new Yellow Vest protests, with dozens of arrests and clashes in Paris and other cities. Police in the capital used water cannon and tear gas as scuffles broke out at the Arc de Triomphe on the 9th consecutive weekend of protests. Some 84,000 demonstrators were recorded nationwide, an increase compared with last week, official figures show. Nationwide protests were initially triggered by the rising price of fuel. They have since widened to include anger at the cost of living, with a wide-ranging list of other demands. Although there were clashes around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, there was not the same kind of violence seen in recent protests, and this is a good thing. This is a good thing. Which is why all these huge trade deals, between the corporations, the governments and countries, are basically to cement the absolute control of large corporations over any business that is taking place around the world, and to crush out just about as many small to medium-sized businesses, mom and pop operations, as they possibly can, because that just makes things way too untidy. And of course it shows, most mom and pop operations or small to medium businesses have to actually create something tangible. And that's what's one of the real big problems that's taken place in our world today, is that most corporations now don't make a lot of tangible things. They just get sold off to each other. They buy each other out in these massive mergers. They gut out the staff. They make it look like it's efficient. They run it for about a year or so, importing, exporting, whatever it is that they do, managing data or so on and so forth. And then they flip it over, and that's what the banks will lend the money to do, and that's actually what happens. So, the only tangible stuff that's being made, except in China and India, are small to medium-sized businesses. Most of the factories, here we have GM in Ontario closing out at the end of the year, gone. That means they will have no manufacturing facilities in Ontario. And where have they gone to? They've gone to India and China and South Korea. And those jobs are not coming back. Banks have threatened to close this weekend so that they can't have a bank run. That tells me just how scared these banks really are of what might happen if people stopped using the banking system. And they know that, like Greece, after the Greece collapse happened, something like 5,000 Bitcoin terminals were dropped into Greece and pressed into service. And that could easily happen in any country in the world should the public take charge of the situation and the banking system fail and leave the public unable to transact, because they will find a way very, 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 very quickly to be able to make transactions happen. And Bitcoin, Ethereum and Litecoin are actually functioning. They are up and running. And Visa and MasterCard are attached to the banking system. They would stall along with the rest of it. And this having one particular day to draw your money out is all very well. But if all of the French public, in fact all of the European public, basically just kept cashing out their pay, as soon as it hit the bank, cash out that money and hold that cash at home in your hand and use it to spend only as and when you need it. Only put money into the bank when a payment is going out, a mortgage payment or something like that. And interesting enough, somebody said that was the answer, was for the French people to stop paying their mortgages and their loans and to force the banks into submission that way. But when you do that, you leave yourself liable. Okay, and that's a real problem. You do not want to see yourself liable in this issue, and you cannot be liable for withdrawing your money out of the bank. And the banks have to allow you to do that. They may shut over the weekend, but they have to open sooner or later, because just like any business, I'm a hairdresser, I need to turn over heads. Banks lend money, they have to turn over money. They can't keep those doors closed for very long. And so just keep cashing out your checks, take that money home and spend it as and when you need it. Only put what you need into the bank, and that will work. That will absolutely work. So please, if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe below. Click that big red button. It really does help when you do. And in the meantime, this is Hound Dog Steve signing off. Hope you have a great week coming up, and we will talk very, very soon. You take care now. See you.